Awesome.
Is that a good idea?
All right.
It looks like he's posing.
Well, we are doing Revelation 4 through 7 is what I had y'all read, but I have it divided 4 or 5 and then 6 to 7, because on the handout that I gave y'all that first week, I just identified this is the scene in heaven, and then 6 to 7 talks about the 7 seals. So we're going to talk first about the scene in heaven. But before we do that, are there any questions or comments or thoughts that arose as y'all read this week, if anybody did? Anything that came up, like, what is that? Or I'm kind of curious about this, or... A lot of it. Well, if there's nothing off the bat, one thing I guess to just go into is this is a vision of heaven that seems to be referencing, like, what God is showing John in this vision is showing him some things that other prophets have already seen in different parts of the Old Testament. And so normally when you get a scene in heaven, usually there's a throne. Usually God is on that throne, and he's red-ish or fire-ish, or looks like burnt bronze, or looks like carnelian and jasper. And God, as this figure in the middle, he's usually surrounded by his heavenly council, or the sons of God, or various different words that'll come up in like Job 1, 1 Kings 22, for different, essentially angelic beings hanging out around him. And this is my, if y'all remember, go-to symbol for an angel, because I think it looks cool and otherworldly and kind of reminds us angels are not people unless they're intentionally adopting the image of one. But they're different than humans. But normally we get something basically like this. And even in the Psalms, what gets referenced is usually just God surrounded by a bunch of angels. In Isaiah 6, you get the addition of some figures called seraphim. And if you remember, we've been talking, Elohim, the I am is plural. It's of Elo, because God, the word for it is plural, the whole Trinity thing. Cherubim, the im makes it plural of cherub. Seraphim, or seraphim, it's plural of seraph. And the word seraph by itself can mean something that's burning, but it's also a normal word for a snake. So a lot of the times that this word shows up in the Old Testament, it's for snakes, particularly that are burning, in the sense that when they bite you, they burn you because they're venomous. So this refers to venomous snakes, as opposed to a chanash, which is just a more general word for a snake. And I say all of this to say, usually seraphim are just shown as angels that are covering their faces and their bodies and have 6 wings, but some people will show them being kind of like big snakes. And I kind of like that, because it would be the only, if there's something other than serpents, it'd be the only time in the Bible this word isn't connected in some sense to serpents. But also, if you think about it, the different cherubim figures look like different animals, and Satan looked like a snake. So what if Satan was one of these angels flying around looking kind of like a snake, and then he decided to rebel and go tempt Adam and Eve, and that's why he looked like a snake? So it's just a thought. This could look like a number of different things. I am what might be the minority opinion. There's like they might actually just look like flying snake angels. But then Ezekiel, you get the addition of what are called the 4 living creatures. I think they're also referred to as cherubim, but they're pretty interesting looking. So if y'all will notice, it's a pretty busy design. You've got 4 basically heads. One's just a circle that just is supposed to represent that it's a human. But we've got an eagle, a lion, and a bull. And in the book of Ezekiel, in the vision of God's presence, Ezekiel sees 4 what he calls living creatures, and all 4 of them have 4 faces. And the 4 faces are of a man, a lion, a bull, and an eagle. In Ezekiel, they are surrounding the throne, and they're accompanied by something called wheels within wheels, and we have no idea what's going on with it, but I was just kind of completing it. So this is sort of a basic picture of the presence of God if you make a composite of all the different Old Testament visions of God's throne room. Sometimes his robe is filling the throne room. Sometimes there's an altar there, but this is basically the cast of heaven when you look into heaven in the Old Testament. So we get something very similar when we come to it in John. So John looks and he sees a throne, and then he sees the figure that's on the throne. This is pretty normal so far. It says that he has something like an emerald rainbow surrounding around above the throne. So that's kind of new and unique. Then it says that there are actually 24 thrones around his throne, and each of them has an elder sitting on it with white robes and gold crowns, which I forgot to animate on the first one. So when I copied and pasted all of them, I didn't want to go back and add 24 more crowns. But they're supposed to have gold crowns on their heads as well. And they're worshiping God. It says that there's something like a sea of... Oh, first it's the flames of fire. So there's 7 flames of fire coming out from the throne of God. I animated this little 7-pointed star between them because if y'all remember from when we were talking about the beginning of the letter, I think references to the 7 spirits of God are references to the Holy Spirit. That 7 spirits of God equals Holy Spirit. And that comes from Isaiah 11. We talked about this, that Isaiah 11 talks about the Messiah being anointed with the Spirit of Yahweh, with the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and fear of the Lord. And so you can count that as 7, and that's what I think this is a reference to. So I believe that that's the Father on the throne. I believe the Holy Spirit is sort of circling the throne in these 7 fires, 7 flames of fire that are appearing. And then it says that they're on something that is like a sea of glass. So I have just this sort of sea, it's sort of see-through. Then you get 4 living creatures, but these are slightly different than the 4 living creatures that showed up in Ezekiel, because the first one doesn't have 4 faces, it just has the face of a lion. Then the next one has the face of a bull, face of a man, and face of an eagle. So there's still 4 of them, but now they've gone from having 4 faces to just 1 face each, and all 4 are different. And there's a couple different explanations about why that is. So at this point we would have to then, we're going to take a step aside from scripture and just go into speculation and thinking things and some church history stuff. So I actually don't know the original reason, what first got this going, but at some point each of these 4 became understood as symbolic representations of the 4 gospel writers. Matthew is the man, Mark is the lion, Luke is the bull, John is the eagle. So if you look at medieval art, actually art going back to the early church, in the late Roman period, in the early medieval period, up until today, people in art are going to symbolize the 4 gospel writers with these 4 angels. So often you'll see, in a church, you've got the part where the congregation's sitting and you've got the sort of 2 wings, in kind of cathedrals that are cross-shaped. The altar is the far part, but the 2 sides and the nave is kind of the main part of the sanctuary. When you come to that middle bit where there's the dome, often you have on the corners the 4 gospel writers. So you'll have a man who's sitting there writing, and he may have a human-faced angel kind of over his shoulder, and that's Matthew. And then the next corner you have a man and he's got a winged lion kind of sitting at his feet. That's Mark, and he's writing his gospel. Then John has an eagle perched by his shoulder, and Luke has he's sitting on top of a bull or something. That's the ox or bull representing Luke. And so why these became connected, I'm not totally sure, but there is a long tradition of these being connected, and therefore some people trying to figure out theological reasons why they should be connected. So one thing that I just think is interesting is the idea that the main theme of Matthew is that Jesus is the new Moses, he's the new prophet, he's the one like Moses that Moses promised would arise. And so this is an emphasis on him as the fulfillment of all the Old Testament promises of him being the priest, the prophet, the one who was to come. So this is sort of primarily the prophet, not the priest. Priest too, but he's the prophet that was coming, like Moses. Mark emphasizes that he is, well, in all four of the emphasis I'm going to talk about are, I believe, in all four Gospels, that these are the emphases. So Matthew emphasizes that Jesus is the human prophet, like Moses, who's coming from God, and that he's the Messiah. Mark emphasizes the kingship of Jesus and what it's like to live as a disciple of the king being represented by a lion. That Luke represents Jesus as the savior for all people, not just the Jews, and that he is the sacrifice for all, that he's the inclusion of both men and women, both slave and free, both Greek and Jew. And so he being an offering for all, he being the suffering servant for all, he's like a sacrificial bull. And so that's sort of him as in a priestly role. And then eagles being connected with the sky, being connected with divinity. John being the gospel more than any of the others that really emphasize that Jesus is God. So we've got Jesus as the coming prophet, Jesus as the coming king, Jesus as the coming sacrifice and savior of all mankind, and then Jesus as God made flesh, represented by those four: the man, the lion, the bull, and the eagle. All of this is speculation. All of this is kind of ad hoc theology based on tradition. But I like it. And then it makes me speculate. A, because this is how a lot of people have taken it, and I'm not totally sure where it originated. B, we know there are four Gospels. And C, those are really big emphases in each of those Gospels. Could it be that that is the original intent, and that these represent angels who are in some way connected to those Gospel messages? Because these are the four animals plus the human that are in the vision with Ezekiel, but for some reason each of these four angels specialized, for lack of a better word. Why did they each go from four faces to having only one of each of the four? And is it possible they were all sort of connected to a particular aspect of the gospel message, that Jesus is the coming prophet, he's the coming king, he's the coming savior, and he's God come to his people? And each of them sort of adopt one of the four gospel books. And I don't really know exactly what all that would mean, but it's interesting to kind of meditate and think on. Why is there this change from Ezekiel to John? The change is probably significant, but not in a sense. Obviously, essentials in essentials unity and non-essentials liberty. So you're free to kind of think whatever you want about these. I do believe this is reflecting angelic beings. I don't think this is reflecting like the four gospel writers in heaven, but it could be. I don't know. They're not actually called angels. They're called the four living creatures. They have these interesting appearances, but as we've learned, what John is shown is not the same thing as what it is. He saw the seven lampstands. The seven lampstands were the seven churches. So they meant something. It's not just like a metaphor for patience or something, but they were symbols for different realities. And it's possible these four represent the four gospel writers in heaven. It's possible that these are some sort of angelic beings who sort of oversee each of the four gospel writers and the four gospels that they wrote. So like this angel is all about declaring essentially the gospel of Matthew, whereas this one is all about declaring the gospel of Mark. Maybe there's something like guardian angels for those books, making sure they get transmitted and translated and copied correctly. I don't know. Again, this is all speculation, but I find it very interesting that a really tiny detail has provoked a lot of thought in the history of Christianity on these four gospel writers, and I don't know, just worth thinking about.
In Ezekiel, is it one being with four faces?
There are four beings. All four of them have four faces. So that's what I showed right here.
Okay.
I even used the same image. I just deleted the other heads, but all four of them have man, eagle, bull, lion. Man, eagle, bull, lion. So there's four of them, and they are there in God's presence. They're typically understood as sort of protecting the holiness of God's presence, that they're there to They're sort of like the guards,
Are they
sort of like the
called- Are they
bodyguards.
called living creatures in Ezekiel?
They're also called the living creatures. I believe they're also referred to as cherubim, whereas in John, in Revelation, they're not referred to as cherubim. So,
Cool.
just worth thinking about.
Would you care if I took a picture of both just to have it?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me find my camera.
And there's so many different like representations of these different things on the internet. I wanted to make my own in like basically cartoonish level of simplicity, so that it's only showing exactly what I wanted to show and doesn't have someone else's art or someone else's take. Plus, it's fun.
I like the symbol.
So then this is the one from John's vision.
Very cool.
So
Um,
Ezekiel is Old Testament, John is New Testament,
Mm-hmm.
so that's the only significance that I can,
Right.
that's just kind of what I'm thinking.
The other thing is, other than maybe 2nd or 3rd John, this is the last book in the Bible. So this is sort of summing up a lot of the experiences of the prophets of the Old Testament, the different promises made by both those prophets and by Jesus and the apostles throughout their lives. So, Jesus talked about there's this great tribulation coming. The apostles talked about there's this day that's going to come when the trumpet will sound and all the dead in Christ shall rise and will meet the Lord in the air. So there's a number of different prophecies and promises that are made by Jesus and the apostles, and John is sort of the last word on what's going to happen in the future for us to live on. So it's like the next thing we expect is that Jesus would come back. That's one thing that, this is totally just a random aside, but like the Old Testament is constantly saying there's going to be a new covenant, there's going to be a new guy. Moses said there's someone who's going to rise like me, you need to listen to him. The son of David is going to arise and he's going to put all his enemies under his footstool. There's this suffering servant who's going to come and he's going to give his life for many. So there's this constant expectation in the Old Testament. There is something new that's going to happen, and there's going to be more words communicated, because this Moses-like guy is going to come and he's going to say stuff and you need to listen to him. And there's going to be a new covenant and you need to be a part of it. So there's an expectation that there's going to be more to this new covenant. There's going to be more words added to God's bank of scripture. Then when you come to the New Testament, there's not really any expectation there's going to be more words. There's only the expectation Jesus is going to return from heaven. So then when other groups like Muhammad, like the Mormons, and a number of other different groups will get their book, they typically try to adopt passages from the Old Testament to say like, oh yeah, see, there's going to be more written stuff. But that's not really the case. The Old Testament anticipated Jesus' coming and the writing of his apostles. Their writings anticipated Jesus was going to come back. There's no anticipation there's going to be more words written down, that there's going to be more revelation. So when other groups try to say, hey, here's this 3rd part of the Bible, or this 4th or 5th or 6th part of the Bible, they don't have the same kind of textual basis that the New Testament does, but then people will just kind of go to the logic, well, after the Old Testament, there was the New Testament. Why can't we just add more after the New Testament? There's a difference between the relationship of the New Testament to the Old Testament versus these books to the New Testament. New Testament isn't figuring that this more stuff is going to be written. But that's just kind of a random aside, but it's like worth thinking about that. Like the Old Testament, it's in its DNA that there's going to be another testament. There's going to be more. That's actually why we call it the Old and New Testament. Testament's just an old word for covenant. It's really the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. The Old Testament's constantly talking about how there's going to be this new covenant. So anyway, that's a little aside. So we get this appearance, and one thing that it says about this appearance of God is that from the throne came flashes of lightning and rumblings and peals of thunder. And that's a phrase that keeps coming up over and over again in the book of Revelation, so I just want to point it out when we see it. So the flashes of lightning, rumblings, and peals of thunder, that's coming from the throne of God. The presence of God is characterized by flashes of lightning, rumblings, and peals of thunder. So that, and then they sing some hymns. So that's basically chapter 4. Is there anything else in chapter 4 that, at this point, y'all are like, I'd love to know more about that. Could we talk about this? Is there anything that stood out?
So what are we thinking the elders are?
Oh, the elders. I forgot. So elders are interpreted a couple different ways. Some people think they're angels. And this is just the appearance of some angels with the living creatures worshiping God. Others would say, in a little bit more literal sense, that he literally saw 24 guys, and this is maybe the 12 patriarchs of Israel, and maybe it's the 12 apostles, except John. So it's like, that doesn't quite work, but maybe it's Paul, because John's not there yet. Or it's just 24 different people God picked that they get to be enthroned with him, that they're like the 24 best, believers. Another way we could understand this is that 24 was all that John saw, so his brain wasn't overloaded by what's represented. Could be all people up to this point who follow God or are in God's presence. So this could be all dead Christians, all dead believers from the Old Testament. And that could be thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions. It could be that the 24 represents the reality of all of the all of the dead spirits of believers and followers of God. So I'd say there's basically those three. These are angelic beings of some kind. These are 24 specifically important people, or this is representative of the followers of God from all ages. 24, 2 times 12, would, the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 apostles. 12 can become representative of both Old and New Testaments. It's doubled 24, so that you got 12 and 12 Old and New Testament believers together. Numbers start doing some weird things when you, so it's called numerology when you start finding theological significance in numbers. And I'm never going to discourage someone from doing it. It's just you can't really derive new meanings from it. I think it's dangerous when you get to a new meaning, but when you get to an established meaning with it, it's like, that's interesting. So another thought immediately off the top of my head is that 24 is 4 times 6. 6 is the number of humanity. 4, we've already seen heavily represented here with the 4 living creatures, which might represent the 4 Gospels. So this could be humans who have responded to the 4 Gospels. 4 times 6, 24. So it's like, that's the kind of numerology that people for so much of church history, people have read into those kind of numbers that way. And in my opinion, as long as you never go off the rails with it, you always land in the right place. You can think about numbers in this way, especially, again, when it's numbers that the Bible gives you. So 6 is the number of humanity. It's the day on which humans were created. 7 is the day of completion on which God rested because he finished his creation. 4, we have the 4 Gospels. So it's like that. You can use those kind of numbers. You can't just kind of make up. I think that 5 means whatever. I don't know. But again, this is all just kind of extra stuff. But there are some times in the Old Testament when the number of something corresponds to some reality. Numbers aren't always the literal number. Sometimes they represent something else, like typically 12 represents 12 tribes of Israel, or just Israel in general. We don't need to keep belaboring that, but if that answers your question. All right, anything else in chapter 4? Okay, in chapter 5, the big question is this scroll. The scroll has 7 seals on it, which means it probably looks like this. It's always kind of been weird to me, what did that actually look like? Until I saw people start actually drawing it, and it makes a lot more sense. The idea is that it's a scroll that's bound up. I don't have a piece of paper, but it's okay. And then 7 seals go down the side, so you have to break all 7 in order to actually open it. The idea of a seal, the idea of a scroll with a seal on it, is that whoever sealed it is kind of mashing it with their authority. He's closing it with his authority. And so only someone who's authorized, who has equal authority or designated authority, is then allowed to break it. Otherwise, they're violating. So who can legitimately open this scroll, who is worthy to open the scroll, is the question that's being asked. And I think it says that John even cries, because he weeps because no one's there, which I just think is an interesting, that part of his vision is that he would undergo this emotion of longing and sadness that no one could open the scroll, to contrast with the revelation of who can open the scroll. So that's interesting. That's just a interesting insight into John, that just like Jeremiah, very much his emotions he experiences are part of the prophetic experience. Jeremiah is often called the weeping prophet, because his lamentation and his sadness is part of the prophetic message, and it's interesting to hear. We get a little snippet of that in John too, because again, he's reliving a lot of the experiences of the Old Testament. So like Ezekiel and Isaiah, he sees the heavenly throne room with the living creatures and different things. Like Jeremiah, he gets to weep as part of his prophecy. But then we get the announcement, it's the Lion of Judah. Lion of Judah, lion, obviously represents kingship, but for the Jews specifically represented this tribe in the Old Testament, in the dividing of the tribes of Israel outside the camp with Moses. The lion is on a banner literally representing the tribe of Judah. And so the Lion of the tribe of Judah is someone who represents and kind of is the heir of Judah, which we know who that is. That's from the line of David, Jesus. And then I found a great picture of the San Vitale Cathedral in Ravenna. This was a place that I went to last summer, and my parents also went to because they heard about me going and they were so jealous they went too. And anybody who can go, if you go to Italy, you need to take time to go to Ravenna. You need to go to the mosaic churches that are there. They're so beautiful. This is in the very top of a mosaic that is like 3 stories tall, just floor to ceiling all the way up to here. Just beautiful, beautiful mosaics. But right in the middle is the Lamb, the exalted Lamb, who is the Lion of Judah. He's the Lion of Judah, but what John actually sees is the Lamb. Now, what's not evident in this picture is that the Lamb is actually slain. That's what he talks about. So the Lamb, when he comes up to grab the scroll, is actually slain. So this is a image stolen, because I steal a lot of things from the Bible Project. Their video on Revelation is great. Their video on everything is great. I disagree with some of their assumptions and how they interpret the book of Revelation, but I love everything that they do, basically. And the Lamb who is slain here is just, it's so well represented that he's there, he's got his crown, but he's got this gash that represents he was killed for the sake of those who, sinned, needed his sacrifice. But he's parading around. He's grabbing the scroll. And that question of, the seal, who has authority to open the seals? Well, the Lion of Judah, the Lamb who was slain, has authority to open the seals. Well, if the seals are God, because it's actually the figure on the throne, God the Father, who is holding the scroll and actually gives it to the Lamb. So here's another picture I stole from them that I love. It begs the question of what that says about the Lamb. If God has sealed with 7 seals a scroll, and the question is who's worthy to open it, and the Lamb is worthy to open it, what does that say about the Lamb? That he is God, that he has the authority of God to open the scroll. And the book of Revelation doesn't actually address what the scroll is. So I heard a professor one time talking about it, how he thinks that it's actually essentially the deed to the universe, that it's sort of like the inheritance of God, and who gets the Father's inheritance? The Son. So he's, Jesus is actually referred to as the heir of all things. So this is him receiving his inheritance. And he has the right to open it because he is the one who has the authority of God to open God's scroll because he is God. But he is particularly earned may not be the right word. It's not as if he didn't have a right to it before, but now he's done the Father's will. He has died for all mankind, and he has ascended to heaven. And so now he gets the reward of everything that he's done. He gets his inheritance. So now he's ascended to heaven and enthroned. And then we get a worship song that's like, holy, holy, holy. And they talk about how worthy is the Lamb to open the scroll. Yeah. It's in a lot of songs. It kind of becomes a standard for most worship forever, because this is the standard of worship, really. This is what heaven looks like. And I had mentioned another week I think that actually chapter 4 represents the present, and chapter 5 either represents the present after Jesus ascended, or him actually taking the scroll is something that happens in the future. Maybe he takes it to like begin the tribulation, and so he hasn't done that yet because the tribulation hasn't started. So I'm not necessarily going to fix chapter 5 somewhere in time, but if I could, maybe this is once he ascended, and he's just holding on to the scroll, waiting for the time that it's appropriate to do it. But our transition to chapter 6, I think, is a transition to the future. So this would be definitely the end of present things. But are there any other questions about chapter 5? Anything you would want to talk about?
That from from verse 11 it says voice of many angels in the circle. We kind of talked about that.
Uh-huh.
Number was 10,000 times 10,000.
I didn't mention that. Thank you. So when the Lamb appears, you actually get a massive multitude of angels. So the word myriad meant 10,000, but also just represented a very large number. So to have 10,000s of 10,000s just meant like so many. And like myriad was one of their biggest numbers that they had. So it kind of like if we're just like millions and millions. But you can't necessarily press this too much because it also refers to it as being innumerable. So it's not literally an infinite number of angels, but it's a huge number of angels. But that would be actually part of why I think that the elders on the throne represent humans, because you get the humans worshiping God, and now we have angels worshiping God, as opposed to angels and then more angels. But not totally certain. We know that there's a lot of worship going on up there, and Jesus deserves it. But any other things in chapter 5? Or we're going to go into chapter 6.
Cool.
Chapter 6 and 7 deal with the 7 seals. So just as a review, we've got our 3 sets of 7. The 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, and the 7 bowls. So when we talk about the 7 seals, 7 trumpets, and the 7 bowls, there's my animation again. I love it. We've got these 3 scenarios. They can either be concurrent. One can be concurrent with a sequence of the other 2, or we can have all of them in sequence. I animated it a lot better this time. I figured it out a little bit better. But we can either have the 7 seals describe the Great Tribulation, then the 7 trumpets, then the 7 bowls. Again, the 7 bowls would be packed up at the back part of the Great Tribulation, but they could run like 7 seals concurrent, and then these 7 trumpets, 7 bowls are sequential, or they can all be sequential, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls. I'll point out a little bit of why I think they're sequential, probably when we do the 7 trumpets, and I'll refer back to the seals. But y'all have seen a little bit of this because I did this a little bit the first week. But when you break the first seal, do you like the animation of you break the seal? And there's the number 1. It says one of the 4 living creatures said, "Come," and then we had an angel come we had a horse come forward that was white, and he had a rider who received a crown and a bow and went out to conquer. So I think this reflects the reality that during the 7 years of the tribulation, you're going to have the rise of the political and military power of the Antichrist. And we had talked about, is this rider the Antichrist, or does it just represent that the Antichrist is going to arise? I don't know. That each of the 4 riders that are going to be with the 4 first seals could represent actual intelligences, that they could be, the Antichrist, and then 4 maybe demonic entities connected to these ideas, or these figures just represent those ideas. But if this just represents the idea, it's representing the fact that there is a person that we would call the Antichrist who's arising in authority during this time. Any question about that? We had kind of talked about that previous week, but
It could be almost like a conglomeration of countries /
Right.
armies.
Yeah. So in the Antichrist figure, there is a amassing of different political units
Mhm.
under his influence. But there is a strong reason to believe that it does culminate on one dictatorial leader. He's very charismatic. There's actually a reference to the fact that it seems like he's actually going to die, or appear to die,
Mhm.
and appear to come back to life.
Mhm.
And some people believe that's actually this figure gets killed, and then his corpse becomes reanimated and possessed by Satan or another demon. And that the original human is actually dead, and so the ruling Antichrist actually becomes this demon-possessed, resuscitated corpse, basically. Other people think it's just a human figure who does die, does come back to life, that Satan is permitted to perform that miracle, and then because he experiences this, people worship him. But
New
the
World
way
Order.
it's
New World Order.
a new world order type stuff, yeah. But another thing that some people will say about the Antichrist figure is that the wording of it, he may not actually like die and come back to life. It could just be a deception that he's trying to copy what made Jesus really influential. Jesus died and came back to life. I died and came back to life, and he fakes it or something. So that's, I mean, it could just be a ploy. But anyway, the crown represents his political authority, the bow represents his military authority, and the white horse is connected with victory. But also a sort of false Christness, because Jesus, when he returns, he also returns on a white horse. So this is a counterfeit white horse. I mean, it's a white horse, but it's mirroring Christ. That's where you get the idea of Antichrist. A lot of times people associate anti just with being against, which it does. It means that. But anti also in Greek can refer to being in the place of someone. So Antichrist both means against Christ and in the place of Christ, trying to take Christ's spot. And it's not totally clear what all he'll say about himself, but it's very possible he's going to teach that he is the Messiah and that a lot of Jews are going to follow him. Well, at the same time, we know that in the end times, a lot of Jews are going to come to faith in Jesus, because Romans talks about that, and I think there's different parts of here that also talk about that there is going to be an end times revival of Jewish people in Israel, but Jewish people everywhere coming to faith in Jesus, and that'll be great. But that's the first seal. The second living creature with the second seal says, "Come," and we get the red horse with the man on it who is equipped with the red sword, or with the great sword, and he is given the authority to take peace from the world and create a lot of war. So again, is the rider an actual demonic entity who inspires war amongst many people, or he just represents that in the rise of the Antichrist's wake, he just multiplies war on the earth, and as this one dictatorial leader is taking more and more power, war just breaking out with a lot. Because the idea is also that whatever number of Christians that say they're Christians today, they've all been taken. I'm assuming that a rapture has taken place, and that means that a large number of people have simply vanished from the earth as far as the world is concerned. And what do you do when a large chunk of the world population, whatever it is, I don't know what the actual population, like percentage of the world is Christian right now. I don't know how you would calculate that.
I don't know.
I think there's like 2 billion Christians, and there's like 7 billion-ish people, and let's say half of those Christians are like genuine believers, so it's like a seventh of the planet just vanishes.
Yeah.
That's gonna really surprise some people.
Okay, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
So I was gonna ask, before you said that, did y'all discuss in previous weeks when we think this is happening, we think the rapture's already taken place, you just said.
Yes.
Okay.
In this timeline. So,
Okay.
Do
And I
we
probably
have
need
any
to
more
watch
of those
it
original?
old.
But not in reality, no.
Right, not in reality. Like, it hasn't happened right now.
No.
When it happens, I will be here.
Right.
We won't be here.
We better not be here, right? No.
So, on that
Okay.
handout, I've got a timeline of what I believe that first line is from the time of Jesus until everything is made new and everything's great.
Okay.
And zoomed in on that 7 years
Mhm.
is that longer line there on the bottom
Okay.
that talks about the events of what I refer to as the 7-year tribulation.
Okay.
So I think the 7-year tribulation begins with the rapture.
Mhm.
All genuine believers are, if they've died, are resurrected, and then everybody together is taken up to be in Jesus' presence. And then we have this 7-year tribulation. Jesus referred to it as the Great Tribulation, that I think is described prophetically by the 7 seals.
Okay.
So in that 7-year period, we've got the rise of the Antichrist. We've got the increase of war.
Okay.
Does that clarify?
Yes. And then one more question, because your opinion from going to school and everything, so
Mhm.
do you think will vanish? You don't think spirits will be gone and bodies will be left?
I think the bodies go.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I did talk about this the first or the second week. I think it was the first week. No. I
It's
just
good
meant,
review, actually.
I'm trying to.
And you'll have access. He's
Yeah. So these are all on YouTube right now, so I can send you a link to see the other ones.
Okay, I would love
But-
to.
When I say that, I meant I was trying to sort of sort through the files in my head. Was that the first week or was that the second week that I talked about that? So when I was talking about that, I emphasized that I believe when the rapture actually happens, before we are taken up, everybody who is in the presence of the Lord spiritually actually returns to their bodies and resurrect. And then the resurrected believers with the believers that are still alive all are taken with their bodies into heaven
Okay.
and then are glorified. And then when Jesus returns, they come with him.
Okay.
And we will all kind of come down at the end of the tribulation with Jesus.
So they can't blame COVID for
Can't blame
2
them.
million people that were taken. Okay. I was just
So
curious.
I do think that the physical bodies actually are gone.
Okay.
It talks about how it'll be in the twinkling of an eye, which is why in the Left Behind series, it seems like just in an instant, suddenly they've disintegrated. I don't know what that'll look like for non-believers. I think that it does take a second. Like we would experience it as moments of time because I believe Jesus is appearing in the sky. We witness all of the dead in Christ rising, and then we with them are carried up. So we would experience it as moments that I think will just be a split second, based on how it talks, in the twinkling of an eye, those different things, coming like a thief in the night. So it's possible that it seems like an instant that we all vanish, but I do think our bodies will be gone. I think that, so Left Behind interprets it really dramatically. I don't know if it'll exactly work like that, but I do think we leave.
Yeah. Okay.
Antichrist starts freaking out, starting a bunch of wars. It seems like he forms and again, this is a little bit later in chapter 13, we'll go into more detail, but it seems like he forms an alliance with either 10 or 9 other kings. And then they kind of, and kings might just represent governments there. So that might just be a UN, kind of a super UN of just these 10 or 11 authorities. And then it seems like 3 of them break off from him. And there's a mini civil war within that 10, where the 7 side with him and 3 are against him and they get annihilated. So there's, basically his rule, he's constantly fighting somebody while also persecuting Christians and Jews. But I think that his persecution of Christians and Jews is more concentrated in the second half of the tribulation. Again, we'll talk about this more because it goes into a lot more detail about some of these prophecies in chapter 13. So we will come back later. But for now, there is a lot of war, and there's a lot of the effects of war. So the third living creature says, "Come," and you get the appearance of a third horse, this one black, and its rider basically brings famine, and has scales representing essentially the economic impact of the famine, of the lack of food, which I think is resulting from the war, which is happening in the rise of this political leader and the general chaos that's been going on when 1/7 of the world just disappeared. There is a prophetic statement about the prices of food that I don't totally know how to understand. I feel like it'll probably be literally more understandable then, but it's essentially talking about the price of food and how the price of food seems to be going up because we've got famine going on. And then the fourth living creature says, "Come," and we get a fourth horse. This one is described as either pale green or ashen, are 2 different ways to understand it, but essentially the idea is that this horse is sick and potentially actually dead and rotting. That might be what the color represents. but his rider's name is Death, and he's followed by Hades, and he's given authority to kill a quarter of the human population. So, again, this could be a demonic entity released by the fourth seal that actually goes and does this, or this could reflect the idea that in the wake of the rise of the Antichrist, all the war and famine and economic pressures that come from that, and even potentially pollution, nuclear radiation, who knows what other kind of issues may come up, spread of disease, a lot of people are going to die. So it says that he is specifically given authority to kill by the sword, which, not just in Revelation, all across the New Testament, anytime you say sword, it really just means by violence. Being put to death by the sword, even when you're just like crucified, you're still put to death by the sword. By the sword just means by physical violence. So by the sword or violence, by wild beasts, by famine, and by disease. So a lot of people are dying, but it would make sense if everybody in the world is at war all at once. And again, a number of times these different seals are referred to as judgments by people. I don't know if it actually says in the text that these 7 are judgments. I say that because seal 5 doesn't seem to correspond to a judgment. It more seems to correspond to just a future reality. This is one of the reasons I think, again, these seals represent realities that will take place during the 7 years, because seal 5 has the altar of God, and then we've got these souls that are under the altar of God, and they're described as being people who died during the tribulation for their faith in Jesus, and they complain to God that their blood hasn't been avenged yet, and they receive robes, and they're told, wait, because there's basically more of y'all that are going to get martyred, and then y'all's blood will be avenged. Okay? I think that that's going to happen. I think that lots of Christians die during the tribulation. I think lots of people who come to faith in Jesus, people who, obviously anyone who believed in at the time of the rapture, I think is taken away. But anyone who comes to faith in Jesus will then, if they die, will go into God's presence. But they're there saying like, we want to be avenged. We were murdered because we loved Jesus. God, when are you going to, make things right, bring about justice? And God's like, in a little while. The 6th seal is an experience of what I have multiple times referred to as celestial darkening, because it's a theme among the different 7s. Each of the 7s has a celestial darkening scene where the sun becomes, there's an earthquake, so that's, they're all shaking because it's an earthquake. But then we get the sun becoming dark, the moon turning to blood, and the stars turning dark and falling from the sky. So that's why it's a celestial darkening. The celestial bodies are becoming dark. And then we get a quick interruption. So those are some angels. It says that the 4 angels that guard the 4 winds, something like that. I've forgotten exactly how they're described.
It says.
So this would be in the middle of
6, 12.
or at the beginning of 7.
Yeah, holding back
After
the
us.
4 winds.
The four angels holding back the 4 winds
Of the
Corners
earth.
of the
Yes, I
earth,
saw
holding
4
back the
angels
4
standing
winds
at
of
the
the
4
earth.
corners of the earth.
to
That no
basically-
wind might blow on earth or sea or against any
right.
tree.
Basically, the wind needs to stop because we're gonna seal some people.
Oh.
So then an angel carrying the seal of God goes and seals some people, and this is where we get the very confusing 144,000.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't actually think it's that confusing, but it's people do all kinds of things with this. So it says there's 144,000. 144,000 is 12 times 12,000. There are 12 tribes of Israel, and we get 12,000 from each of them. Except, actually, it's not quite the 12 tribes of Israel. Some editing has been done. So normally you get either Joseph and Levi or Manasseh and Ephraim. You don't normally get Joseph, Manasseh, and Levi all together. If Manasseh shows up, you get Ephraim, because Manasseh is half of Joseph and Ephraim is half of Joseph. So where's Ephraim? Well, this is probably reflecting Ephraim. Ephraim is considered, so it was Manasseh and Ephraim were born. And then when they were blessed, they were actually, their order was reversed as far as who is the favored son, because that just happens over and over and over again in Genesis, where the younger son becomes the favored, which I think is there's a lot of reasons why that is theologically significant. But we don't get Ephraim, we just get Joseph and Manasseh, so I think that represents that the tribe of Joseph, or the tribe of Manasseh, is the true heir of Joseph. I think that's a way to explain why they're there. But where's the tribe of Dan? The tribe of Dan is missing. And I think it's possibly because the tribe of Dan in the north of Israel seemed to basically head up worship of idols in a lot of ways in the northern kingdom. Also, Dan is not actually where it's supposed to be. Their original allotment of land, they basically said, like, so they saw Judah, in faith. So going back to the time of the judges, going back to the time of Joshua, Joshua kind of like, cool, tribes, y'all, we do some initial conquering, and now tribes, y'all conquer the rest of your allotments of land. And Judah keeps going. The tribe of Judah conquers all of their land. And the other tribes don't quite get everything. They don't have the same kind of faith because their ability to conquer is tied to their faith. But Dan completely gives up. They're like, there's no way we're going to be able to conquer these places, so we're going to go get some others. We're going to go find some other land. And they pick a valley that they think is going to be like more fertile and is less controlled, but incidentally ends up being the one valley every single invader is ever going to go through, because if you're going to invade the nation of Israel, you need to go through this one valley. Well, it just happens to be right in the middle of where Dan's territory is. So Dan is always going to be the first tribe annihilated whenever there's an invading army. So they picked the wrong spot, but they never end up conquering their allotment in the land like that God allotted to them. So is it possible? Because they never actually took their allotment of land. They never actually are considered like an heir of Israel. They were so key in bringing about idolatry in the land, in the northern kingdom of Israel when they split into two kingdoms. So maybe that's why Dan is missing. But anyway, this is an interesting list for those several reasons. Dan is missing. Levi is included, even though Levi often isn't. Joseph is included instead of Ephraim. And I also don't understand the order. Like, there's probably some significance to the order, but I haven't thought that much through it. Anyway, so it's an interesting list. But what does it actually mean? So that's a different question. I do actually believe this reflects that a number, I don't know that this is actually 12,000, it might be literally 12,000, but a number of Jews will become Christians during the time of the tribulation, and that they are specifically sealed to be protected from things that go on. And so in a supernatural way, they are defended against any kind of celestial darkening, earthquakes, the other, effects of war, effects of famine. There's a time that seems like with the trumpets that actual demons are released to visibly, physically come and afflict human beings. But the 144,000 that are sealed are specifically exempt from it. So I think that this reflects a class of people. I think that they're Jewish. I think that during the tribulation they've converted to Jesus. I don't know that it's literally 144,000. Because again, these numbers don't always necessarily reflect a literal amount. 12 represents the 12 tribes of Israel. 12 represents God's completion when it comes to groups of people. So there's 12 apostles, there's 12 tribes. And 1,000 could just represent a lot of people. So if it came down to it and things were going on, and there were 13,000 from Judah, and there were only 11,000 from Issachar, and there were only 6,000 from Joseph, I probably wouldn't be that offended by that. I'd say these numbers were then being symbolic. But as we already established, our God is powerful. He's miraculous. It's possible that there are actually 12,000 of each of these tribes that are designated. that he knows in the end times are going to convert, and then they get sealed as such. So it does, by providence, become literally 144,000. And I would be like, wow, God is good at predicting the future.
So in all your study, do you know where, or know, do these people know, like, oh, I'm from Judah, you know?
So that is an interesting question, because at this point in history, nobody really knows if they're from most of these tribes. Because quick Old Testament review, the nation, they're not really unified under the judges. The judges are kind of piecemeal, controlling maybe these tribes and influencing these tribes and leading these tribes in a coalition against oppressors. But it's not until Saul that all of the 12 tribes are united under one king, and then they're united under David, and they're united under Solomon, and then his son Rehoboam basically is a jerk, and because he promises, Solomon did some things that weren't the best, and he kind of forced a bunch of people into labor, and the people were like, cool, we built his palace and we built the temple, can we not do all the forced labor stuff now? And Rehoboam's like, basically because he's trying to, show him who's boss, rather than just be like, yes, as a gift from your new king, I will lower the labor requirement. He's like, I'm going to double it. And they're like, no. So they go with a different guy, and the 10 northern tribes split off from the kingdom of Judah. And I think it's Benjamin, tribe of Benjamin, that stays with them. But again, the number of tribes is a little bit wonky, because like Levi didn't actually have land, so the tribe of Levi was still with them. And then it seems like members of the tribe of Simeon were still around. So it's like Judah, Simeon, Benjamin, and Levi are in the southern kingdom, and then all of these other ones are in the northern kingdom, which theoretically is 10, but is kind of 9. And that gets wiped out by the Assyrians. And to our knowledge, there's not really any of those people that like can trace their ancestry back to, I'm from Reuben, I'm from Gad, I'm from Zebulun. Whereas there are people, at the time of Jesus at least, that can trace their line, because the people of Judah, they get exiled to Babylon, but they still maintain their Jewish heritage. And then when they come back to the land, they're still keeping up the records and everything. That's why we know that the line of David is unbroken from from David to Jesus, because when they go away, it's Jeconiah, and then he's got some children, and we end up with Zerubbabel, and he's the governor, and so we get this unbroken line from David to Jesus. But like today, if somebody's last name and they're Jewish, if their last name is Cohen, they're almost definitely from the tribe of Levi, or at least someone, number of goes back, because Cohen or Khan or Cone are some of the different ways I've heard it pronounced, come from Kohen, which means a priest. So they're from the tribe of Levi. So that's actually speculation. It's possible that there are no genetic descendants of Zebulun or Reuben left. But the people who are sealed are actually sealed as designated as being from that tribe. So like Zebulun has no more heirs. But these 12,000 Jews, maybe some of them are genetically from Judah and some of them are genetically from Benjamin. But God's saying, you guys get to be part of Zebulun's inheritance. I'm giving an inheritance back to Zebulun. That could be what's happening. But I mean, God knows. So it's very possible that there are Jews of all of these ancestries, and the 144,000 that end up on that day are genetically connected, and he knows the genealogy even if they don't. But it's unlikely that anyone today knows a genealogy from any of these except maybe Levi, Judah, maybe Benjamin. So, does that answer that question? Okay. Yes?
I'm just curious of what you think the significance is of the younger always being favored more than the older.
Oh, so, I mean, there's a couple things. So in Genesis, you get, with Abraham's kids, Isaac is favored because he's actually the legitimate son of the wife Sarah. the older son Ishmael is rejected because he wasn't supposed to sleep with his slave. He wasn't supposed to try to accomplish God's purpose his own way. So that's a little bit more obvious, but you still end up with the younger son being favored. Then with Isaac, his 2 kids, he's got twins, but the younger son ends up being favored. It seems like because the younger son actually has faith while the older son doesn't, and yet he lies to get the favor. So that's a little bit interesting, which shows that God works with people who are sinful anyway. And then among Jacob's sons, Reuben, in Jacob's very old age, apparently Jacob is taking younger wives because Reuben ends up sleeping with some of his father's wives. So, like, literally, God's like, no. Through Jacob, like, no. So he, even though he's the oldest of the 12, he gets negated as heir. Simeon and Levi, they have a longer story about why through violence they lose their right to be first. So then the 4th son, Judah, actually becomes the heir. So it's like in each choice of the younger being over the older ones, there's a logic to it. But when you get to Joseph and his 2 sons, he walks up his 2 sons to where, I'm trying to remember.
It's his deathbed, right?
It's Jacob on his deathbed, and he literally walks up his older son and his younger son in his left hand and right hand, so that Jacob will put his right hand on the older and his left hand on the younger, and he crosses them. And his and Joseph's like, no, you're wrong, and Jacob's like, basically this is what's right. So then he puts his right hand on the younger son, which right hand is associated with greater blessing with the. So then it seems like he's chosen almost just because Jacob knows God's picking him, but why exactly we don't know. So it's like the circumstances of each of them, you can figure out a logic except of these last ones. But one thing that keeps coming up is the fact that God is choosing the underdog, is how some people will put it. God gets to choose who's favored. It's not based on pedigree. It's not based on worthiness. It's based on grace. God chooses who he works through and who he uses. And often that's the person that doesn't seem qualified for it. Therefore, he gets to forgive. He gets to extend grace. He gets to show that he's the one working because this weak person couldn't do it on their own. They require his strength. So then he gets to show up more with the more powerful individual. Or with the weaker individual, he gets to show up more powerfully. So I think that is tied up in why, but there's also probably something to the fact of like, even, we're going to have an old covenant and a new covenant, and the new covenant is the one that is favored. That Christ, we've got the first Adam and the last Adam. We've got the older one and the younger one, but the last Adam is the one who saves the world and is the one in whom everyone is transferred from the old Adam. So there's probably a number of theological kind of dimensions to it, but I think it's primarily God uses the younger because he can use who he wants, and he wants to show he goes with the weaker and the humble, and because there's also probably a pride versus humility thing to it. Again, there's probably a lot of kind of parabolic truth we can draw out of. He usually picks the younger. So that's kind of a tangent. One thing that this question raised for me is, what if there's like 200,000 Jews that become Christians? What's that math? 56,000 of them just don't get seals. So what if the numbers exceed these 12,000? And that could be where either it's like, these are the 12,000 to get 104,000 because God is proving I am faithful to my people. I will preserve a remnant. He says that through the whole Old Testament, I'm going to preserve a remnant. But then any beyond that is just bonus, and it's awesome. And maybe they get seals too, but they're not part of this group. But that could also be where 12,000 is just a representative number. If there's 1 million from the tribe of Judah, and 2 million from the tribe of Naphtali, and 8 million from the tribe of Benjamin, awesome. 12,000 just represents the completion of God's fulfillment to these tribes. Because he said there will be a day when, actually that's a whole other thing in the Old Testament, there's a promise that Israel is going to be restored. Israel is what they called the northern kingdom. So the northern kingdom with all the tribes, southern kingdom under the control of Judah. there are promises that those two will be reunited, and there will be a remnant from all of Israel that will come and be part of the Messiah's kingdom. So this is them being part of Messiah's kingdom. Again, even if there's no genetic descendants of Issachar, God can make genetic descendants of Issachar by declaring them so. He's adopted them into the Issachar family. Now Issachar gets 12,000 descendants, or 1,000,000 descendants represented by this number that seems to represent much completion, 12,000. But does that make sense? Any other questions about that? Does that, any thoughts, comments, concerns? I do want to point out, so this is another interesting thing. This is the first of 3 times that in the middle of the 7, the 6th one, we get an interruption before the 7th one. So you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, interruption, and then the 7th. And then when we go to the trumpets, we're going to get the same thing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, interruption, 7. And then we're going to get some other bit stuff. That's the 12, 13, 14. But once we get into 15, 16, we get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, earthquake, and then Jesus comes back. So I think that these interruptions are interesting.
More than a commercial break.
More than a commercial break, because they are happening in similar places. But then we finally get to the 7th seal, which I realize your handout doesn't have because it's the beginning of chapter 8. But the beginning of chapter 8 basically just says, and the Lamb opened the 7th seal, and there was silence in heaven for about 30 minutes, which I have represented by, we've got some noise happening, and then the noise goes away to represent the silence, because how else do you visually represent the silence? But we have this is so odd. It's kind of anticlimactic. We had, the white horse with the conqueror, the red horse with war, the black horse with famine, the dead horse with death, the altar with all the martyrs underneath it. We've got the celestial darkening. We've got the 144,000 sealed. And then we get silence. It's like, that's kind of interesting. This is an odd kind of transition. But it's about to go, in the beginning of 8, straight into the 7 trumpets. But it mentions that there's 7 trumpets. Then we get this verse. Then it goes into the 7 trumpets. But this verse is interesting to me because I want to point out, like I pointed out in God's presence, it says, "Then the angel took the censer that was, full of the incense of the altar of God, and he filled it with fire from the altar and threw it on the earth, and there were peals of thunder and rumblings and flashes of lightning and an earthquake." So it's the second time we've gotten peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning. And this time we get an earthquake. This is happening here at the end of the 7 seals. Spoiler.
There's an earthquake in the 6th seal.
And there's an earthquake in the 6th seal. But spoiler, the end of the 7 trumpets has flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, and an earthquake. And then the 7 bowls, the last bowl is an earthquake, where we get flashes of lightning, thunder, peals of thunder, and rumblings. And then when Jesus shows up on earth, it says he speaks with the sound of many waters and the roar of many thunders, as an earthquake is happening in the 7th seal, or the 7th bowl, to destroy the city of Babylon. So while an earthquake's going on, Jesus is appearing. We've got rumblings of thunder. But as in chapter 4, the appearance of God might be what's happening when we get the peals of thunder, the rumblings, the flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. When does God come to earth? At the end of the tribulation. So this is one of the pieces of data that I think points to the idea that at the end of the 7 seals, we get Christ returning to earth. We get God appearing on earth. So we've finished the tribulation. Now we're going to go back and we're going to do the 7 years of the tribulation again, but from a different perspective. So then with the 7 trumpets, we go through the 7 trumpets, and then the 7 trumpets ends with peals of thunder, with rumblings, with flashes of lightning, and then an earthquake, appearance of God on earth. Then we're going to go back again. And we're going to go through the 7 years again. Then we get the same thing. And then we get an interlude about how it's awesome that Babylon's been destroyed. And then we finally get to see what Jesus returning looks like. So that's why I have moved towards this perspective. But a lot of people are going to see, so I've moved towards the scenario 1 perspective. That,
Do you care if I take that?
oh yeah, of course.
I'm not gonna do anything with it except look at it.
Yeah. So I think that this is what we've just gone through. And we get flashes of lightning, peals of thunder, rumblings, and an earthquake. Then we're going to do this, and we're going to get flashes of lightning, peals of thunder, and an earthquake. And then we're going to do this, but it's actually here, and we're going to get flashes of lightning, peals of thunder, and an earthquake. That's why I've kind of moved to this perspective. But, like I've pointed out with these, some people say the seals as summarized in the 7, and then when we go through that middle bit, the transition from trumpets to bowls is in there, or like this. So a way to explain it is that the flashes of lightning, rolls of thunder, what I'm seeing as indication of the conclusion is just a lot of divine happenings going on. That there's an inbreaking periodically through the tribulation of God. He's coming. This is maybe almost like, this is probably a crude metaphor, but in Jurassic Park, you've got the T-Rexes coming and you get the ripples in the water.
Mm-hmm.
That it's like this could be evidence throughout the story that God's coming. Okay, now we're going to the trumpets. And as we get to the end of the trumpets, we've got another rumbling. God is coming. And we go into the bowls. And so, I'm not saying mine's a slam dunk. It's definitely scenario 1 with them going concurrent. But that's part of why I've slid that direction. But a lot of the time indicators and things, it comes down to individual verses. When do I think certain things are happening? But still. So just explaining, that's kind of why, from my perspective, coming to the end of this, we've actually come to Jesus is returning. And now we're going to go back in time when we come to the next week. And we're going to do 8 through, let's say 8 through 13 next week. And if we don't do all of it, that's okay. But that's 8 through 11, I think, is go through it again. And then 12 through 16 is go through it again, a third time. And then finally we get Jesus. So that's the perspective I'm coming through. But other people are going to explain it in sequence and put these 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls in more specific spots in the tribulation. I'm okay with the 7 seals, 7 trumpets describing the tribulation, not necessarily referring to where I can nail down, okay, this definitely takes place in the first half. This definitely takes place in the second half. I think that there's some of that, but it'll be, we'll get there when we talk about those. But anyway, so that is the end of the 7 seals, the scene in heaven and the 7 seals. And we're going to start 7 trumpets next week. And then I don't know how long those will take, especially because a lot of things that I think need to be explained about that, I've gotten to explain this week. So it may not take as long to go through the 7 trumpets. So we might be able to get into 12 and 13. But if not, it's okay. We'll just come back to it at a later time. But so if you can read 8 through 13, that'd be great. So now you can ask questions, but I am finished.
So here, you might be disappointed in me for asking this, but so scenario 1,
Mm-hmm.
is this way not looking at it right? Is there essentially just one earthquake? In other words,
I'm basically seeing it as one earthquake.
Okay.
That there is a big earthquake that destroys the city of Babylon,
okay,
which we don't know if that's literal. We'll talk about this when we get closer to 17 and 18, but we don't know if that's literally the city of Babylon,
okay,
or if it's the city of Jerusalem,
okay.
or if it's a different city. But it's the city that seems to have spiritual and economic significance for the empire of the Antichrist. And there is actually a very high level of emphasis on the fact that economic power is running through this city, and it is exploitative economic power. And it seems like actually its money goes towards funding war efforts, and particularly warring on Christians and Jews and killing Christians and Jews, because it talks about how the city is actually tied up in the death of Christians. So a way to understand that is that, you know, it is funding the economy of the Antichrist empire and getting him a lot of money for actually, you know, running his war machine and his persecution machine of killing a bunch of people. But so I think that earthquake is the appearance of God on earth that is actually destroying the city of Babylon, and is actually the seventh bowl. But there could be multiple earthquakes. I think that's totally possible. Another thing that I saw is each of the 3 series of I say them so often that I sometimes am forgetting the words: seals, trumpets, and bowls. Each of the 3 sevens of seals, trumpets, and bowls have a seal, trumpet, or bowl that correspond to celestial darkening. That's why I've kind of used that phrase of the sun is going dark or turning dark, or a third of it is darkening. And then, you know, the stars and the moon is turning to blood, or a third of the moon is turning dark. So it's like you can have things that affect the way we perceive the celestial bodies, like multiple times. But I think there's just a darkening that happens, potentially just exhaust fumes and mushroom clouds, and I mean, for all we know, the Antichrist nukes somebody, so then you end up with a nuclear winter type circumstances, and then you get atmospheric conditions that are affecting, you know, literally a third of the day. You can't see the sun because there's so many clouds and ash and stuff. So, but it could, we can never try to split too many hairs between what is a supernatural judgment, where God literally says, you don't get to see the sun for a third of the day, or as a sign of God's sovereignty, he literally, like a pie, cuts the sun into a third. I think that's what here I just have it turned black. It's in, I think, one of the trumpets that it's a third of the sun I show go dark. But it's like, is it just it's a dark for a third of the time? And it's like, God can definitely do that. So anytime I say it, it's like, that could be the ash from the nuclear war or something like that. What I'm saying is, often prophecies are fulfilled by events that happen that God has ordained, but events that are happening through a human agency, like someone firing a missile. But it's completely possible, like at the splitting of the sea with Moses, that God just does a miracle. So he just has the water stand up like a wall, using the wind to hold it up. Or he just darkens a third of the sun to just show, hey, here's the sun, here's a third of it dark. There is proof for the rest of the 7 years that there is a God in heaven who's in control, and he said he was going to darken a third of the sun, and guess what? He has. But it could be atmospheric conditions. So I'm never gonna I'm never gonna dismiss the idea that God could be doing all of these things supernaturally, but I also don't want to neglect the idea that this could be representative of the fact that in the wake of this massive war, it is illogical to think that a lot of destruction could create atmospheric conditions, and that could be what is symbolized. Does that make sense? So there's always a possibility it's a symbol for a naturalistic event that's part of these things, or it's a literal thing, or it's symbolic of a miracle God is performing. And I never want to say one is dumb, basically. Like, it could be either. I'm not going to definitively rule this is definitely a miracle, this is definitely, a symbolic way of describing a natural event, because it could be either. This is one thing that I don't know how much I've talked about so far as we've been doing Revelation, but is really important to keep in mind with prophecy. The prophecies of the Old Testament, the people who wrote them, who read them, didn't understand the fullness of their significance until they were fulfilled. So like the fact that the Messiah was going to die and rise again is something that's very clear in the Old Testament, but hindsight is 2020, which is always fun to say around. eyes. We're in an eye doctor clinic. I love it. But hindsight is 2020. Very few people actually knew that the Messiah was going to die and rise again. That seems almost ridiculous until you actually come to the event of it happening. So they would interpret it as maybe there's two Messiahs. There's one who dies for the people, and then one who rises as a son of David and becomes a king. So that's actually a really normal Jewish interpretation, that they'll call the son of Joseph and the son of David. They'll split the Messiah into two figures, because one has to die and one has to reign. Well, what if the Messiah actually just dies and then reigns because he's resurrected? That didn't occur to a lot of Jews. There were actually some that were expecting the Messiah to come back to life, but they were rarer. So all that to say, prophecy is primarily for the people at the moment that it's being fulfilled, being able to recognize that this moment was predicted. And while people who are reading the prophecy before its fulfillment can be encouraged by it and edified by it, its full fulfillment can't be understood until it's actually happening, and that's always been how it was. So the fact that the Messiah was going to come from Bethlehem, the fact that the Messiah was going to be of the house of David, but actually born by really humble means, a lot of people didn't understand that. So that's why Herod was expecting a wealthy king-like figure and was surprised when it was actually a baby. So that's why he just tried to kill all the babies of Bethlehem, because this is his kind of terroristic, sloppy effort to just how do I deal with this? There's a lot of aspects of the prophecies that aren't clear until they're happening in the moment. It's like the fact that the Messiah, like none of his bones were going to be broken, and his clothes were going to be gambled over, and his hands and feet were going to be pierced. And it's like at the time that David was writing that psalm, it's Psalm 22, it prophesies a lot of some of the really specific details about his crucifixion. It's almost kind of ridiculous to think some of those things would happen. But then you find out those actually become really normal as part of Roman crucifixions, that there would be pierced hands and feet outstretched in a cross. Their clothes would be divided up primarily by gambling over them. But like if there were 4 shirts, each of the 4 guards get them. But if there's only 3, you have to gamble for it. And that just became like normal for crucifixions. But like, how would David have known that 1,000 years earlier? And actually, it's interesting because for a while after crucifixion became illegal, people didn't know that. So then they would read events of the Old Testament, like in the 1800s, 1700s, 1800s, and they'd be like, these are just random, why would the soldiers be gambling over his clothes? That doesn't make any sense. Until we've then gone back and discovered other texts and translated certain things and found out that actually it's really normal for soldiers at the time. So it's like, it wasn't known by David. It was common at the time of Jesus. It was then forgotten, and then we've rediscovered the data about it. But all along, we've known this is what was going to happen to the Messiah, that his clothes were going to be gambled over, that he wasn't going to break any bones, even though that's very abnormal for a crucifixion. So I say all of that to say that like the amount of detail that goes into some of the prophecies when you study them about Jesus, his life, about his crucifixion, were not initially understood to mean that. And it's only in their fulfillment in Jesus that we understood. And again, when we get there, we'll recognize, I don't think I'll be there because I think I'm going to be in heaven during the tribulation, but in history, it will be known that what was written in the book of Revelation was an accurate prediction of what happened, even if we can't nail down exactly, like right now, what that manifestation looks like. Does that make sense?
That's good.
Yeah. So, I just think that's really important to keep in mind, that, like, even the thought just came and then ran away.
That does that.
I hate it when it does that. It was about Jesus. Anyway, so, but yeah, that's all I have for y'all. Hope that answered your question. Any other questions? Yeah.
The way you were saying your idea is that they happen and then they just go back and repeat with different kinds of details for each
Yes.
one. Would that kind of be like how the Gospels are? There's the same events from different perspectives?
Yes, so it would be kind of different, because if you'll notice on the handout that I gave that other week, I did say there is a kind of interesting bent to them. So the seals are almost everything, like
Very general.
very general. And then the trumpets seem to be specifically like aimed at people that don't follow God, as well as environmental effects. So like the third seal talks about how there's a famine. but I think first, second, and third trumpet actually refer to specific, like water and streams are becoming poisonous, and ships are being destroyed, and trees are burning up, and so you get more specifics about some of the ecological damage that's going on, and then you get like the fifth trumpet. The fifth trumpet is some demonic seeming entities. I think they're demons coming and torturing people, but they can't touch believers. They can only touch non-believers. Whereas the bowls, if I remember correctly, all seem to be very specifically aimed at just the followers of the Antichrist. So it's not just like we've got some demons flying around torturing people, and they're only torturing non-believers. They won't torture believers. Now it's like specifically followers of the Antichrist get boils. Specifically followers of the Antichrist, have an earthquake that like rocks fall on them, or there's a kind of enigmatic statement actually. I think it's the fifth or sixth bowl about how darkness is poured over the throne of the Antichrist, so that his followers experience anguish. I don't know what that means exactly, but it's an image, and so we'll talk about it more. But does
I
that
can't wait
make
to see
sense?
your
So it's like
image.
there seems to be.
We'll turn all the
So,
lights off.
Like the Gospels, where I do say that I think that Matthew is invested in getting you to see Jesus as the new Moses. Mark is invested in getting you to see that he's the king you have to give everything up for. He gives up everything for you, so you have to give everything up for him. Luke is the one who's showing that this is the gospel to all nations and includes everyone. And then John is showing you that Jesus is God. I think that these show that the seals mark a very significant prophetic event in history as they're building towards, these are kind of the general things that are going to happen. The trumpets specifically dealing with the ecological damage and the distinction between believers and non-believers. And then the bowls seem to be aimed specifically at followers of the Antichrist and taking him down.
You ever had any thought about correlation between the plagues with Moses going to Pharaoh and any of this?
Yes, actually, that'll come up next week because we'll talk about the two witnesses, and the two witnesses specifically get powers that are similar to Elijah and Moses, and we'll talk about that. But so we'll keep unpacking this. But any other questions? We technically have 2 more minutes, but if not, we can dismiss. Never fear. Okay.
Cool, man. Thanks, Rick.
So I do want